The silence of Viridia was its most cherished attribute, a living quiet composed of the rustle of silver-leafed ferns and the soft, rhythmic pulse of the resonance bloom. Dr. Eris Thorne had come to this world for that silence, a place where the universe's endless noise was replaced by a gentle, planetary hum. He was a xenobotanist, a man who preferred the company of xylem and phloem to that of soldiers and politicians, and Viridia was his paradise, a world untouched by the scars of war that marred so many other human colonies. His hands, calloused from sample gathering and delicate instrument calibration, were not made for weapons. They were made for nurturing, for understanding. He was studying the resonance bloom, a planet-wide network of fungal flora that communicated through subsonic vibrations and soft, bioluminescent waves of light, a symphony of life that he was just beginning to translate. The work was his passion, but the reason he was here, the reason his heart was anchored to this small, prefabricated colony of Haven, was his sister, Ilara. She was a terraforming apprentice, younger than him by a decade, with a spirit as bright and untamed as the nebula she dreamed of one day shaping. She saw the universe not as a hostile void, but as a canvas, and her optimism was the gravity that kept Eris's more cynical nature from floating away entirely. She would join him in the primary biodome after her shifts, her face smudged with viridian soil, and they would watch the bloom pulse in waves of turquoise and violet, her laughter echoing softly off the dome's plexiglass as he explained his latest discovery. It was during one such evening, as the twin moons began their ascent, that the silence was broken. It wasn't a sound that shattered it, but a cessation. The gentle hum of the bloom abruptly stopped, plunging the colony into a profound and unsettling stillness. Then came the resonance, a sharp, discordant frequency that vibrated not in the ears, but deep within the bone. A feeling of cold, geometric wrongness. The stalkers had arrived. They were not invaders in the traditional sense. They did not announce themselves with the roar of engines or the flash of plasma fire. They simply appeared, moving through the narrow corridors of Haven like crystalline ghosts, their multifaceted bodies absorbing light and sound. They were silicon-based, silent predators who communicated through precisely modulated frequencies, and they viewed the chaotic, warm energy of organic life as nothing more than a resource to be harvested. People didn't scream for long. The stalker's touch was a rapid, terrifying process of energy transference. Life, heat, electricity, it was all drawn into their crystalline forms, leaving behind nothing but cold, gray, petrified husks, statues of frozen terror. Eris grabbed Ilara's hand, his scientific mind shutting down as pure, primal instinct took over. "The biodome!" he yelled, his voice sounding alien in the new, dead quiet. "The airlock is reinforced. They can't get through it." They ran, the rhythmic thud of their boots the only sound in a world that had forgotten how to make noise. They passed the frozen forms of their friends and colleagues, faces locked in expressions of shock and disbelief. There was no blood, no gore, just this terrible, orderly stillness. A stalker emerged from a side corridor, its form like a shard of obsidian, its head a complex lattice of crystals that refracted the red emergency lights into 1,000 predatory glints. Eris shoved Ilara ahead of him, fumbling with the keypad for the biodome's airlock. His fingers felt clumsy, thick with adrenaline. Almost there. "Ilara, almost there," he chanted, a desperate mantra against the encroaching silence. The inner door hissed open. "Go," he screamed, pushing her through. As he turned to follow, the stalker was upon them, moving with a speed that seemed to defy its rigid structure. It did not lunge for him. Its target was the brighter spark, the more vibrant energy. Alara, she saw it coming and, in a final, selfless act of love that would forever be seared into Aris's memory, she shoved him with all her might. He stumbled backward into the airlock, his momentum carrying him past the threshold. The inner door began to slide shut as she slammed her hand on the exterior control panel, overriding the cycle. He watched, helpless, through the meter-thick reinforced glass as the stalker's arm, a blade of razor-sharp crystal, extended and pierced her chest. There was no sound, only the sight of her bright, vibrant life being siphoned away, the color drained from her skin, her clothes, her hair, all of it turning a uniform, stony gray. Her eyes, wide with shock, were fixed on his, and her mouth opened in a silent scream that he would hear for the rest of his life. The stalker retracted its limb, the process complete in mere seconds. Alara was gone, replaced by a perfect, lifeless statue, an effigy of his failure. The creature then turned its multifaceted head to look directly at him, and Eris felt its consciousness brush against his own, a cold, dispassionate curiosity, an analytical resonance that held no malice, no triumph, no remorse. It was the alien equivalent of a scientist observing a chemical reaction, and in that moment, Eris's universe collapsed into a singularity of pain. He didn't scream. The sound was trapped behind a wall of grief so immense it stole the air from his lungs. The outer airlock door sealed with a final, definitive thud, encasing him in his sanctuary, now his tomb. He was alone with the silent, pulsing flora he had come to love, surrounded by the life he had sought to understand, while the only life that had ever truly mattered was now a monument to his powerlessness. Just a few meters away, he fell to his knees on the soft, loamy floor of the biodome, his body convulsing with silent sobs. Grief was not a wave washing over him. It was the entire ocean, dragging him down into an abyss of absolute loss. A single tear, then another, traced paths through the grime on his cheek and fell, splashing softly onto the intricate root system of the resonance bloom that was woven through the biodome's floor. He was unaware of it, lost in his sorrow, but where his tear fell, the nearest node of the bloom flickered violently. His grief, a raw, powerful, uniquely human emotion, was a frequency this world had never known. It was not like the simple fear of a prey animal or the territorial aggression of a predator. It was a complex symphony of love, loss, memory, and despair, and it poured from him, a psychic broadcast of pure agony. The single node overloaded by this new and potent signal pulsed a deep, blood red. That pulse did not fade. It spread, racing through the planet-wide fungal network, a contagion of sorrow. Across the surface of Viridia, the gentle and melodic light of the bloom began to change. The soft turquoise and violet waves were replaced by a chaotic, angry crimson. The subsonic hum that had defined the planet's peace shifted, its frequency dropping into a discordant, guttural growl that vibrated through the very bedrock of the world. Eris, his face pressed against the cold glass of the viewport, his gaze fixed on the gray statue of his sister, slowly became aware of the change. Outside, the world was coming alive. The silver-leafed ferns began to writhe, their fronds coiling and tightening like metallic fists. The vines that draped gracefully from the monolithic trees, once docile, now slithered across the ground with serpentine speed, thickening and hardening as they moved, and the very air grew hazy as flowers, once known for their benign, sweet-smelling pollen, now released clouds of caustic, corrosive spores that sizzled on contact with the stalker's crystalline bodies. The ground itself began to tremble as massive root systems, empowered by the new, aggressive energy flooding the network, erupted from the soil like colossal spears, impaling the uncomprehending aliens. Eris looked at his hands, then at the weeping plants around him, then back out at the waking nightmare. He was a pacifist, a man of science. He had never held a weapon, had never conceived of taking a life, but his grief, his purely human sorrow, had just armed a world. He saw the stalker that had killed Alara, the one whose cold mind had touched his. It was trying to retreat, its smooth, calculated movements now jerky and uncertain. It was surrounded, the roots of a massive and pulsating flower, its crimson light now blindingly intense, coiled around its legs, tightening their grip. The stalker emitted a high-frequency pulse, no longer of curiosity, but of something new, a static of confusion that grated against Eris's mind. Then, as a thick, thorny vine wrapped around its torso and began to constrict with inexorable force, the resonance changed again. The analytical coldness was gone, replaced by a frantic, shrieking broadcast of pure, unadulterated terror. For the first time, Eris understood the stalker. For the first time, it understood fear. And as he watched the creature that took everything from him being slowly and silently crushed by the grieving planet, Eris Thorn did not feel horror. He did not feel pity. He felt the first, cold spark of a purpose he had never wanted, born from a pain the galaxy had never known. The initial, visceral satisfaction of watching his sister's killer be dismantled by a world's worth of rage faded into a profound and terrifying clarity. The biodome, once his haven of scientific inquiry, had become the cockpit of a planetary war machine, and his own broken heart was its engine. He was the ghost in this machine, a nexus of pain that had somehow become a conductor for Viridia's latent defensive capabilities. He pressed his palms against the cool plexiglass, the vibrations from the enraged planet thrumming up his arms and into his chest, a morbid harmony with his own frantic pulse. Outside, the slaughter was methodical. What had begun as a chaotic eruption of nature's fury was now evolving, becoming more focused, more intelligent. Eris watched as a pack of stalkers, their crystalline forms flickering as they attempted to recalibrate their energy shields against the corrosive pollen, were herded into a narrow ravine by a coordinated movement of the thick, thorny vines. Once they were trapped, the very rock walls of the ravine seemed to compress, great slabs of earth and stone pushed inward by the titanic force of the root systems below, crushing the aliens into glittering dust. It wasn't random, it was tactical. The planet was learning, or, more accurately, he was learning. The thought sent a tremor of ice through him. He looked at his hands, half expecting them to be glowing red. Was this conscious? He closed his eyes, forcing the image of Alara's petrified form from his mind, and tried to remember her alive. He pictured her laughter as she'd helped him plant a particularly stubborn Jovian orchid, the way her nose would wrinkle when she concentrated. He held on to the warmth of that memory, the love, the simple, uncomplicated joy. He pushed it outward, a silent plea for peace, for the gentle silence to return. For a moment, the crimson glare of the resonance bloom outside the dome seemed to soften, its angry, jagged pulses smoothing into something less violent. The deep, guttural growl of the planet lessened, and a few of the writhing ferns stilled. It worked. A wave of dizzying relief washed over him. He could stop it. He could quiet the storm. But then, his gaze drifted back to the airlock, to the gray, silent statue that was all he had left of her. The memory of the stalker's cold, analytical touch on his mind, the sight of its crystalline blade piercing her heart, it all came rushing back. A tidal wave of fury that obliterated the fragile peace he had momentarily found. The warmth vanished, consumed by an inferno of hatred. Instantly, the planet responded. The crimson light flared with renewed intensity, brighter and more violent than before. A colossal tree near the ravine, a titan of bark and silver leaves, tore itself from the ground, its root ball a writhing mass of earthen tentacles, and began to shamble across the landscape like a vengeful god, its huge branches smashing down on the remaining stalkers with geological force. The brief respite was over. The rage was easier. The rage was a shield against the soul-crushing weight of his loss. Peace required him to accept she was gone. War allowed him to pretend he was still fighting for her. He was no longer just a grieving brother. He was an avenger, and Viridia was his sword. The stalkers, for their part, were not idle. Their initial confusion had been replaced by cold, terrifying logic. The disorganized harvesting parties across the colony had ceased their movements. Eris watched through the dome's external sensors as they began to converge, not in a panic, but in disciplined, geometric formations. They had identified the source of the anomaly. They knew the planetary aggression was not random, that it radiated from a single point, from him. Their strategy shifted from resource collection to targeted extermination. They began their assault on the biodome not with brute force, but with science. A trio of stalkers approached, their multifaceted bodies shimmering. They didn't attack. They stopped 100 meters out and deployed tripod-like devices that hummed with a low, resonant energy. They were scanning, analyzing the structure, the energy signature, the very molecular composition of the dome. They were looking for a weakness. Eris felt a new kind of fear, not the primal terror of being hunted, but the intellectual dread of being outthought. He was a botanist, not a soldier. He knew plants, not battle tactics, but the planet knew. Its network, the bloom, was a living system that had defended itself against blights, parasites, and geological catastrophes for millennia. It knew how to fight. He just had to tell it what to fear. He focused on the scanners, on the alien hum that grated against his senses. He didn't just see them as a threat. He poured all his hatred for what they represented, the cold, sterile logic that had murdered his sister into his connection with the bloom. They are a sickness, he thought, the sentiment echoing through the fungal network not as words, but as pure, weaponized intent. The ground around the stalker scanners began to soften, turning from solid soil into a thick, viscous mud. The tripods tilted, their frequencies wavering. Before the aliens could react, the mud began to bubble, and from it emerged dozens of viridian pitcher plants. Their mouths, normally the size of a man's fist, now swollen to the size of cannons. Their interiors glowed with a volatile red light. With a series of wet, percussive pops, they fired, not water, but globes of thick, biological acid sailed through the air, arcing directly toward the scanners. The stalkers' energy shields flared as they tried to intercept the projectiles, but the acid wasn't an energy weapon. It was a chemical one. The moment the globes made contact, they adhered, sizzling and eating through the shields and the crystalline structures beneath. The scanners melted into slag, and the stalkers themselves recoiled, their forms pitted and dissolving, letting out silent, shrieking bursts of high-frequency distress signals. They had failed, and they had learned. The next wave was different. They brought a weapon, a large, mobile focusing crystal that floated on a silent, anti-gravitic base. It drew power from the 5 stalkers arrayed around it, concentrating ambient energy into a single, terrifying point of light. It was aiming for the weakest point of the dome, the main viewport, the very plexiglass he was peering through. Eris's heart hammered against his ribs. This was a direct attack, an execution. His grief surged, raw and unfiltered. She was right here. He screamed into the network, the memory of Alara's final moments playing over and over in his mind. Right here, you will not touch this place. The planet's response was immediate and apocalyptic. The ground directly in front of the biodome tore open. It wasn't a root or a vine this time. It was a section of the resonance bloom itself, a pulsating, crimson heart of the network, miles wide, rising to the surface. It looked like a colossal, living coral reef, a solid wall of glowing, angry fungal matter. As the stalker weapon fired its brilliant white beam of energy, the wall of bloom pulsed, absorbing the blast completely. The energy didn't dissipate. It was consumed, drawn into the network. The crimson light of the wall intensified, the white energy of the beam visible within it, swirling like captured lightning. Then, with a planetary roar that Eris felt in the marrow of his bones, the wall fired it back. The beam that erupted from the bloom was no longer white and sterile. It was a chaotic, blood-red torrent of pure life force, a river of weaponized vitality that struck the focusing crystal with the force of a meteor. The crystal didn't just shatter, it vaporized. The 5 stalkers around it were annihilated instantly, their crystalline structures unable to process the sheer, overwhelming chaos of organic energy. They simply ceased to exist. The assault was broken. For now, Eris collapsed, his back sliding down the viewport, his body trembling with the chilling, debilitating exhaustion. Powering the planet's rage was draining him, not just physically, but emotionally. He was feeding the fire with his own memories, burning the very essence of his love for Alara to fuel his war of vengeance. Each victory left him feeling colder, emptier. He looked at his reflection in the darkened plexiglass. The man staring back was a stranger. His eyes, once filled with scientific curiosity, were now hollowed out, haunted. His face was a mask of grim determination, etched with lines of pain he hadn't earned through age. He was becoming a monster made of sorrow. As the twin moons of Viridia rose, casting a pale, ethereal light over the crimson pulsing battlefield, a new sensation brushed against his mind. It wasn't the planet's thrumming rage or the stalker's shrieking fear. It was something new, a single, focused, and impossibly cold resonance beam from orbit, passing harmlessly through the dome's structure to touch him, and only him. It was not an attack. It was a designation, a single, clear, analytical thought, translated from their frequency-based language into a concept he could understand. Source. The stalkers on the ground were merely scouts. Now, the true intelligence behind them, the mind in the cold, silent dark between worlds, had turned its gaze upon him. They knew where he was. They knew what he was. They just didn't understand how a single, soft-bodied creature, fueled by an illogical, inefficient emotional state, could possibly be doing this. And Eris knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than any weapon, that they were coming to dissect the answer. The orbital designation was a declaration of war on a scale Eris could barely comprehend. He was no longer just the target of a ground-based harvesting operation. He was the primary adversary of an interstellar intelligence. The cold, precise touch of that beam on his mind felt like a scalpel tracing the line of an incision, a promise of a clinical, dispassionate vivisection. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in his throat, but it was quickly submerged by the now familiar tide of rage. Let them come. Let them see firsthand the consequences of their sterile calculations. He was the ghost in Viridia's machine, and he would haunt them to their last glittering shard. The stalkers shifted their strategy again, this time with a terrifying and almost insulting patience. They stopped the direct assaults. The ground troops pulled back, forming a wide, perfect cordon several kilometers from the biodome, just outside the effective range of the planet's most violent and immediate defenses. They were content to wait, to observe. From orbit, they began their campaign. It started not with a weapon, but with a sound. A single, pure, high-frequency tone broadcast from their orbiting vessel, so high on the sonic spectrum that it was almost imperceptible to human ears, but to the resonance bloom, it was a drill bit boring into its brain. The planet shrieked. The crimson light of the bloom began to flicker and strobe erratically, like a dying star. The subsonic growl faltered, disrupted by the piercing alien frequency. Eris felt it in his skull, a splitting headache that synchronized with the planet's agony. The flora outside began to spasm. The sentient vines recoiled, coiling in on themselves. The colossal, mobile trees shuddered and stopped, their great limbs trembling. The stalkers were not trying to destroy the planet. They were trying to sever his connection to it. They were attempting to isolate him, to cut the strings of the puppet master. He fought back. He clutched his head, his knuckles white, and focused past the pain. He poured his grief, his rage, every raw emotion he had right into the network, trying to overpower the alien signal. He focused on Alara, on the injustice of her death, on the cold void where her laughter used to be. "This is our world," he screamed into the bloom, a silent, desperate war cry. "Our pain, you will not silence it." The planet responded to the raw power of his emotion. The crimson light stabilized, the flickering ceased, and the deep, angry hum returned, pushing back against the stalker frequency in a subsonic battle of wills. It was a stalemate, a brutal, grinding war of attrition fought in resonance and light. But it was taking a toll. Eris felt a profound, soul-deep weariness, as if his very life force was being siphoned away to maintain the planet's defenses. He needed to rest, to sleep, but he knew if he let his concentration slip for even a moment, the alien signal would win. He was trapped in a state of perpetual, agonizing vigilance. Days blurred into a single, continuous nightmare. He survived on the biodome's nutrient paste and recycled water, his body growing gaunt, his eyes sinking deeper into their sockets. He would pace the length of the dome, a caged animal fueled by grief and stimulants. His world reduced to the thrum of the planet and the piercing shriek from the heavens. He was losing himself, the scientist Eris Thorn being consumed by the vengeful entity he had become. The stalkers, patient and logical, recognized the stalemate. And so, they escalated. They began to drop things from orbit, not bombs or kinetic rods, but something far more insidious. They were containment units, sleek, black obelisks that fell from the sky and embedded themselves in the Viridian soil just inside their cordon. At first, they did nothing. They were inert, silent. Eris watched them on the external sensors with a gnawing sense of dread. Then, they activated. Each obelisk projected a localized field, a bubble of null energy about 100 meters in diameter. Inside these bubbles, the resonance bloom simply died. The crimson light winked out. The plant life withered into black dust, and the very soil turned sterile and gray. The effect was horrifying. It was like watching a cancer spread across the living skin of the world, creating dead zones where the planet's life force could not reach. They were creating a line of dead Earth, a quarantine line, methodically advancing it toward the biodome, clearing a path for their ground troops. With every new dead zone, his connection to the wider planetary network grew weaker, his control more tenuous. The pain in his head intensified as the planet's own agony grew. He was fighting a war on two fronts, holding back the sonic assault from orbit while trying to halt the creeping death on the ground. He tried to fight the obelisks, to command the roots and vines to attack them, but his reach was diminishing. The plants at the edge of the dead zones would wither before they could get close enough. It was a siege, a slow, methodical strangulation, and he was losing. Desperation became his new fuel. He had to do something drastic, something the stalkers wouldn't anticipate. Their weakness was their logic. They couldn't comprehend illogical, self-destructive acts. He looked at the biodome around him, at the carefully curated ecosystems, the years of his and Alara's work. It was a sanctuary of life, and he was about to turn it into a bomb. The primary power source for the Haven colony, housed in a sublevel beneath the biodome, was a compact fusion core. It was designed to provide clean, stable energy for centuries, if you overloaded it. However, if you bypassed every single safety protocol, he made his way to the engineering console, his hands shaking not with fear, but with a terrible resolve. He remembered Ilara showing him the core's schematics, her eyes wide with excitement as she explained the principles of sustained fusion. Now he was using that shared knowledge to orchestrate a cataclysm. The overrides were complex, but his mind, sharpened by days of intense focus, moved with a feverish speed. He initiated the sequence, setting a 10-minute timer. That was all the time he would have. He sent a final powerful command into the planetary network, a command born not of rage, but of pure, sacrificial intent. It was an idea, a strategy so alien to the planet's normal functions that it took every ounce of his will to communicate it. Let them in. On the battlefield, the effect was immediate. The aggressive flora, the writhing vines and mobile trees that formed the first line of defense around the biodome, suddenly went limp. The crimson glow of the bloom nearest the dome faded to a soft, passive violet. He had lowered the shields. From the stalker's perspective, it was an unconditional surrender. Their logic dictated that their sonic and biological warfare had finally broken the anomaly. The source was weakened, its control shattered. The obelisks paused their advance. The ground troops, the cordon of silent crystalline soldiers, began to move forward, their movements precise and confident. They were no longer fighting a chaotic, unpredictable force. They were advancing on a known, compromised target. They flowed into the now undefended zone around the biodome, converging on the structure that housed their enemy. Eris watched them come on the monitors, a river of black crystal and cold light. They surrounded the biodome, their multifaceted eyes absorbing the soft, violet glow, their scanners probing the now passive structure. He could feel their collective mind brush against his, a resonance of cold, clinical triumph. The fusion core's warning sirens began to blare, a frantic, human sound in the otherwise silent dome. 5 minutes. He walked to the viewport one last time and looked out at the petrified statue of his sister, now surrounded by her killers. He placed his hand on the glass. "This won't bring you back." "Ilara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I know that, but they will not have this world. They will not erase you. They will remember your name, even if they can't speak it. They will remember it in fire." 2 minutes. He focused his mind one last time, not on the planet as a whole, but on the small patch of it directly beneath his feet, the ground under and around the biodome. He didn't push rage into it. He pushed a memory, the last good memory he had, Alara. Laughing, her face lit by the bioluminescent glow of the bloom, her hands covered in rich, viridian soil. He pushed love, joy, and the devastating, beautiful pain of having had something so wonderful to lose. He gave the planet his heart, and then he let go. The fusion core reached critical mass. The world outside the viewport dissolved into a silent, impossible sphere of pure white light. The biodome, the surrounding stalkers, and the statue of Alara were all instantly vaporized, erased from existence in a flash of man-made starfire. But Eris's final act was not one of destruction alone. The raw, emotional energy he had poured into the ground at the last second, amplified 1,000-fold by the cataclysmic blast of the fusion core, became something new. It wasn't just a signal anymore. The planet had learned rage. It had learned grief. In that final, explosive moment, as his own consciousness was scattered into atoms, Eris Thorn taught Viridia how to remember. The shockwave of the blast was not just physical, it was psychic, a wave of pure, concentrated memory that washed over the entire planet. And as it did, every node of the resonance bloom, from the deepest oceans to the highest mountains, pulsed once, not with angry crimson or passive violet, but with a brilliant, defiant gold the color of Alara's laughter in his final memory. The war for Viridia was over. The war of Viridia was just beginning. The entity that was once Eris Thorn did not experience death. It experienced dissemination. His consciousness, his memories, his all-consuming grief, and his final, desperate act of love were flung across the planetary network of the resonance bloom, seared into its fungal synapses by the pure energy of the fusion core's detonation. He was no longer a man in a dome. He was the ghost in the ghost, a sentient memory imprinted upon the world soul. He was everywhere and nowhere, a silent observer woven into the fabric of the life he had sought to protect. From this new, fractured perspective, he witnessed the aftermath of his sacrifice. The psychic shockwave of the blast had done more than just change the color of the bloom. It had fundamentally altered the planet's consciousness. Viridia was no longer just reacting to his emotions. It had assimilated them. It now possessed a memory of loss, a concept of injustice. It had a reason to fight. The stalkers, reeling from the unexpected and illogical cataclysm, felt the shift immediately. The orbital vessel, designated Primary Analyst, registered the change not as an energy spike, but as an information cascade. The planet's chaotic, emotional frequency had coalesced into something terrifyingly coherent, a singular, unified, and utterly implacable will. The intelligence aboard the Primary Analyst, a collective of senior stalker minds known as the Conclave, struggled to process the new data. Their models had predicted the human anomaly's eventual exhaustion and collapse. They had not predicted tactical self-annihilation as a method of signal amplification. It was a move devoid of logic, a strategic blunder of the highest order, and yet it had worked. The human was gone, but his emotion remained, now more potent and focused than ever. On the ground, the remaining stalker forces felt the change in a more visceral way. The dead zones created by their obelisks were no longer dead. From the sterile, gray soil, new life was erupting. It wasn't the native silver-leafed flora of Viridia. It was something new, something born of grief and radiation. Crystalline structures, sharp and jagged like obsidian shards, grew from the ground, mimicking the stalker's own forms, but glowing with an internal, golden light. They were plant-based facsimiles of the invaders, a mocking, organic echo of their own nature. Then they began to resonate, not with the cold, sterile frequencies of the stalkers, but with a low, mournful hum that was a perfect sonic embodiment of sorrow. For the stalkers, it was torture. Their minds, built on a foundation of pure logic and data, were ill-equipped to process the complex, irrational waveforms of grief. The sound was a psychic abrasive, grinding away at their coherence, introducing the alien concepts of despair and futility into their networked consciousness. They began to fracture, not physically, but mentally. Units on the ground would stop, their movements becoming erratic. Some simply stood motionless, their internal light flickering, seemingly lost in the overwhelming tide of sorrow. Others turned on each other, their precise energy weapons discharging wildly as their logic centers were eroded by the planetary lament. Aboard the primary analyst, the conclave watched in disbelief. The planet was not just fighting them, it was mourning at them. It was weaponizing the very concept of loss. The High Analyst, a being designated colder than glass, whose form was a flawless 10-foot prism of pure crystal, emitted a sharp pulse of command frequency. Cease ground operations. Full withdrawal and orbital quarantine. Analyze the new botanical weapon. We must understand the function of this grief. The retreat was orderly but desperate. Stalker dropships descended to retrieve the remaining ground forces, but the planet did not make it easy. The new crystalline flora pulsed, and the air around them shimmered, not with pollen, but with a visible distortion of light and sound, a field of pure melancholy. Stalker shields, designed to deflect energy and kinetic force, had no defense against an emotional assault. The fields caused their navigation and propulsion systems to flicker and fail as the very logic gates of their technology were infected by the irrational signal. Several ships faltered, listing drunkenly before crashing back to the surface, where they were swiftly overgrown by the golden, crystalline plants, their power cores silenced, their occupants entombed in a forest of sorrow. The ghost of Eris watched this, not with triumph, but with a profound, echoing emptiness. The planet's victory felt hollow. He had saved Viridia, but the cost was the loss of its innocence. The gentle, silent world he had loved was gone, replaced by a warrior forged in his own personal hell. Its beauty was now sharp, its silence now heavy with memory. The stalkers who escaped to orbit were changed. They brought the infection with them. The sorrow frequency vice, embedded in their energy fields and crystalline structures, it began to propagate through the sterile corridors of the primary analyst. It was a psychic plague. Crew members would suddenly cease their duties, their internal light dimming as they were overwhelmed by a feeling they could not name but which manifested as a total system shutdown. The conclave found their own unified consciousness beginning to fray. Cold, hard data was now tinged with an inexplicable sense of finality, of irreversible loss. Their strategic projections, once clear and precise, were now clouded by a variable they couldn't quantify: despair. Colder than glass, in an act of unprecedented logic, severed the infected sections of the ship's network from the whole, quarantining a full third of its own mind. It then focused its remaining, untainted intellect on the problem. It replayed the final moments of the human anomaly's life, analyzing the energy signature, the psychic broadcast, the impossible fusion of emotion and atomic fire. It finally came to a conclusion that was both terrifying and irrefutable. The human had not just weaponized his grief. He had transformed it into a legacy. He had encoded his own personal loss into the very life code of the planet. Viridia didn't just feel grief. It was grief. It was a living monument, a planetary tombstone, and the name on that tombstone. The source of this incredible power was Alara, This is not a weapon. Colder than glass pulsed to the remaining conclave. It is a curse, a self-replicating emotional contagion. We cannot analyze it. We cannot contain it. We can only flee. The decision was unanimous. The primary analyst turned its sleek, obsidian prow away from the golden glowing world and initiated a series of faster-than-light jumps, not to a new target, but in a panicked, randomized flight path away from the Viridian system. They were running, not from a fleet or a superweapon, but from a feeling, as the last, faint signature of the stalker vessel vanished from the system. A profound quiet settled over Viridia. The golden glow of the resonance bloom softened, its mournful hum fading into a gentle, resonant pulse. The crystalline flora stopped growing, standing as a silent, glittering memorial to the brief, brutal war.